Good, recording, great. Once upon a time, a long time ago, in ancient Israel, there was a well-to-do man who lived in the land of Gilead. Now, he was well respected, he was well known, very successful. In a way, he was living, the quote-unquote Gilead dream. He had the wife, he had kids, nice house, big yard, picket fence, nice little dog, he's probably named Frodo or something. A couple of beautiful cars in the driveway. Get where I'm going? He had the works, had it all. Anything he could ever wanted, he had. But he also had an unknown and hidden sinful desire for sexual pleasure. And in a momentary lapse of judgment, he goes and he visits the local prostitute. And from this unholy union, a child is conceived. And his name is Jephthah, meaning who God sets free. See, this kid, he wasn't necessarily born in the best era of Israelite history. Prior to this, Israel and all of its people had been enslaved in Egypt for many years, upwards of 400 years. And in that time there, they had forgotten everything. They had forgotten who their God was. They had forgotten what their God told them. They had even forgotten the promise that their God had made to them to give them a land flowing with milk and honey. But God was going to be faithful to that promise. So he raises up a man named Moses to lead these people out of Egypt, through the Red Sea, and into a giant desert. But that's beyond the point. They have to stay there in this desert for 40 years because of their unfaithfulness. No one from that generation, except 2 people, would be able to pass on. There even came a day when Moses, the great and mighty and majestic Moses, wouldn't be able to pass into the promised land because of his own sin. So when he passes away, a man named Joshua would come up. Joshua takes the leadership position and leads them across the Jordan River into the promised land. Into this land that God said, is going to be abundantly amazing. Joshua starts slowly reclaiming the land bit by bit from people who had been living there. You see, during the time that they had been in Egypt, many other people groups had moved in and established their own kingdoms there. So Joshua comes in, starts battling them one by one, taking over the land bit by bit. Until eventually Joshua passes away. Who will lead God's people now? And will God still remain faithful to his promise? This is when God raises up these people called judges. The people who would try to justify the kingdom of God and make it righteous, make it holy once more. And it would go on through a couple of those until eventually we get to a boy who was born of a well-to-do individual and a prostitute. This is Jephthah. And he grew up in his father's family. So that might have been a little awkward. I think that God has ordained many types of families as God-centering, besides your typical biologic family. But as I've heard from people growing up in those situations, it's hard. Adoption, it's hard. Step-siblings, step-parents, it's hard. Half-siblings, they're hard. Imagine with me for a second, though, that, you're in a family. You're your little brother. You've got other brothers. You've got other sisters. Mom and dad. And then your half-brother over here who, every time you see him, it's a reminder, oh yeah, remember that time that dad left us and slept with a prostitute? He's there. He's a constant reminder of that shame that you carry and that your family carries. I imagine that I looked bad on them, and none of the other kids in the neighborhood would want to associate with them. Imagine the bullying and the tormenting that they must have done to their younger brother Jephthah. All because his mother was a prostitute. You know they would have bullied him his entire life. And that's exactly what they did. Eventually their father will pass away. And when he does, the rest of the siblings come together and tell him, "You're not getting any of this. This is ours. You're not a part of our family. You're not a part of our clan. Just leave." So that's what he does. Jephthah had to learn how to be independent in order to survive. And he leaves his quote-unquote family. He's alone for the first time physically after being spiritually alone his entire life. And he goes to the land of Tob, where he would eventually meet up with a group of shifty characters, the likes of which that the legends don't even describe. And he leads them. Now, we don't know exactly what they were. Could he have been a bandit? Maybe. Could he have been a mercenary? We don't know. Possibly. All we know for certain is he was their leader, and he had abandoned his God. Now, the Ammonites were one of those people groups who had moved into the area while Israel was gone in Egypt. They were a decent-sized kingdom to the north side. You know, think of this as like Maysville to our Grayson, except a little bit further. And these people had been a thorn in the side of Israel for years. Generations earlier, during the time of one of the other judges, they teamed up with the kingdom of Moab. And those two kingdoms decided, hey, we're going to go invade Israel. So they move in. God has to send another one of the judges to come and kick them out. But the Ammonites were tired of this back and forth game. They wanted to finish this once and for all. So our king decides to pack up all the armies, all the troops, and move in, start marching, start camping on Gilead for a full-on invasion. And the people there were nervous because they dreaded the idea of being conquered once more. Of course, the elders were in a panic. What do we do? We can't just let this people group, this other kingdom, take over what God has told us is going to be ours. God's going to have to be faithful to his promise, but somebody's got to step up and do something. We have to find someone. Who's the only person we know who's crazy and wild enough to stand up to a king? Remember that guy Jephthah? He's like a mercenary out in Tob. Let's go get him. So they travel out and they find Jephthah. By this point, years have passed. He has his own family now. Something that he's wanted his entire life. He has a wife. He has a wonderful one and only daughter. And they go to him and say, "Please, lead us in our fight against the Ammonites." And Jephthah, he just kind of laughs. He's like, "See, that's funny. You want me to lead through you." See, because I distinctly remember you telling me that I'm not a part of your people group anymore. But what did you have in mind? Just out of curiosity. And the elders go, "We know we have done such things to you, but we are turning to you now. Come, help us fight the Ammonites, and you will be the head over all of Gilead." So Jephthah went, and he began to rule over all those who lived there. And if this sounds crazy, it is. I want you to imagine that your home church is looking for a new senior pastor, someone to guide you spiritually, someone to look over all of the administration of your church. And your elders, they pray for it, and they look over Scripture, and after much time and much debate, they hire somebody like Billy the Kid, like just a complete outlaw. Like the type of guy who would shoot a man in Reno once just to watch him die. Like that's the kind of guy that Jephthah is. And yet he's supposed to be this moral and upright judge of God's holy people. But he accepts. He becomes the leader. And his first course of action is to kick out the Ammonites. He does this by sending a personal letter to the king himself. And this is what he writes. He said, Israel didn't take the land of Moab from the Ammonites, but when we came up out of Egypt, Israel went through the wilderness, past the Red Sea, and on to Kadesh. Then we sent messengers to the kings of the land, saying, Please give us permission to go through your country. But they would not listen. So you know what we did? We stayed in Kadesh. So we made our way through the land of the Ammonites, making sure to stay clear off the path of Edom and Moab, because we didn't want to trespass. Then Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who ruled in Heshbon. And he said to him, Please let us pass through your country to your own place. And Sihon, however, did not let us pass through his territory. And he mustered up all the troops that he had and encamped us at Jahaz and fought with us. Then the Lord, get this, then the Lord, the God of Israel, gave Sihon and his whole army into our hands. And we defeated him. We took over all of the land of the Amorites who lived in the country, and we captured their land. Here's what I got to say to you, sir. Now, since the God, our God, the Lord of Israel, has driven out the Amorites out of the people of Israel, what right do you have to take it over? Will you not take what your God Heshbon has given you? Likewise, whatever the Lord has given to us, we will possess. Are you any better than Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab? Did he even quarrel with us? For 300 years, Israel occupied Heshbon, Aor, and the surrounding regions of Arnon. Why didn't you retake us during that time? Sir, I have not wronged you. We've done nothing wrong. But you are wronging me. You're wronging all of us by waging war against us. But if you want to fight, listen closely. Because we already know who's going to win. The Lord, the God of Israel, has promised this land to us today. And he will be faithful to the promise. That's a pretty strong stance. Imagine being the letter carrier to this. And knowing what it says, having to go to the king of the Ammonites. Here you go, sir. The king, of course, he opens up the scroll and he reads it for himself, or someone else reads it to him. He reads through it and just goes, meh, crumbles it up, throws it off to the side, and continues on with his plan to invade Israel anyway. This, of course, means war. Jephthah was a rugged man, but he was still only a man. And as anyone who's ever been in the military will tell you, war is hard on anyone. But God knew that they would win this battle. So he sends his spirit to come upon Jephthah. Does that sound weird? Again? The fact that God's spirit would bestow on anyone prior to Pentecost? I understand if you think that way. But we have to remember, the Spirit is an equal person of the Trinity and has been there before creation. He was there at the beginning, and he was also there with the other judges. God's Spirit would come upon each of these judges and enable them to do the miraculous things that they needed. It's not to say that God endorsed any of these people. Each one of them had their own character flaws and negative personality traits and things that truly separated them from the holiness that is God. But God was just using anyone to advance his kingdom, or showing that anyone can be used to advance the kingdom of God. More so. So this guy, he has the power of God on his side. There should be nothing that holds him back from trusting this faithfulness. And yet, he still had reservations. He wasn't quite confident enough. So he thinks back to his early childhood, what he knows a little bit about God. And he thinks back to his time spent in Tob and the rest of his life encountering other gods and seeing other people worship in many ways. And he thinks up a plan and he thinks it up quick. He says, okay, God, baby, buddy, listen to me. I got an idea. If you're so faithful as you say you are, then why don't we put that to the test? If you give me the hand of the Ammonites, if you give them into our hands, Whatever comes through the door of my house when I return in victory, that will belong to you. And I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. Now you hear this and we panic. I'm sure anybody else who heard this at first would have been like, did he just say that? Did he really just say that? There must have been people there who heard this when he said that, saying, maybe he's just very confident an animal will walk out of the door. And that's true. Animals go through doors. My dog personally goes through the door of my house a couple times a day. But you know who goes with the dog every time it goes in and out of the door? I do. Because doors are made for people to go in and out of. The likelihood that Jephthah here is thinking about offering an animal is slim. He knows who comes in and out of the door. Or maybe, you have another guy over there saying, I can't believe you just made that promise. Maybe he just really doesn't think that God's going to give us the victory here. Or perhaps might it have been that Jephthah's moral character, his integrity, had been so low that he was willing to sacrifice anything to keep his newly acquired power in Gilead. Oftentimes, we say half jokingly, man, I'd kill for something right now. We have to say, it's 12:30 at night and we're sitting in our dorms, man, I'd kill for a good cheeseburger right now. Jephthah is taking that logic to an actual extreme. I would kill to maintain my power here. And yet, at the same time, I don't think he knew what was going to happen. The time for the battle approached, and we don't know many details of this battle. But what we do know is that Israel met the Ammonites and defeated them. Probably swiftly, probably securely, and sent them back to their homeland. This was a cause for a major festival. As the men were returning home from battle, the women would have been in their homes preparing for this festival, as was customary. It would have been cooking meals. They would have been preparing songs. They would have been preparing dances. And as they're preparing, here come the men, chest high, spoils of victory behind them, knowing that the God of the universe is on their side, and that they've just won this battle. And Jephthah's walking back to his home when he sees his house. And who should come to meet him? Not only walking, not only running, but dancing for joy, but his only daughter, passing through the doorway. And in an instant, Jephthah's heart sunk. For he knew what this meant. How could I have done this? He said. How could I have been so foolish as to be willing to give up her? But I have made a vow to the Lord. I've made a covenant with him in my eyes, and in my eyes I cannot break that. And his daughter was in full agreement. My father, she replied, you had given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you have promised, now that the Lord has avenged you from your enemies, the Ammonites. But grant me this one request, she said. Give me 2 months to roam the hills with my friends, for I must grieve, because I will never marry. I will never grow old. So he let her do as she had wished. And she and her friends went out to the countryside and wept for 2 months over the fact that she would never grow old. She would never marry. And after 2 months, the girl stayed true to her promise and returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed. She was as close to innocent as a young woman could get. And yet, she was still sacrificed. I want to be able to tell you that there's some good side of the story. That there's some redeeming moment in the next few verses that just magically makes everything better. There's really not. The best thing I can tell you is that Israel, the young women of Israel, they meet together for 4 days every year to mourn the loss of this young woman. But besides that, there's just sorrow and the loss of a young woman far before her time. Jephthah goes on to lead Israel for another 6 years to little acclaim. The Ammonites return again and again and again, all throughout the Old Testament, constantly being a thorn in the side of Israel. And the spiritual state of the nation would continue to decline. This is the story of Jephthah. Hold on a second. This is not making any sense to anybody else. It's just a weird story to just randomly be in the Bible. I cannot be the only person who's saying this, right? I mean, why would God allow for someone to sacrifice their own child? Why would he stop Abraham from doing the same thing, yet allow this to happen? And why is this being treated as a true form of worship? Unless it's not. What if this isn't an act of worship? Because it's not. You see, in a poor, sad twist of fate, Jephthah never had to make the vow that he made to God. He had the Spirit of God upon him. It was the same Spirit that had helped the previous judges. God could have easily empowered him to take over the Ammonites and force them out. There was no reason for this young woman to be murdered. And let's be honest, let's cut straight to the fact. She was murdered. This was not a God-willing, God-honoring sacrifice. God didn't give the land over to Israel because some crazed lunatic said to God, "You know, God, if you give me their hand, I will give you my daughter." No, that couldn't be any further from the truth. It says that right in the law. In Deuteronomy 18:10 it states, "There shall be no one found among you who offers their child, their son or daughter, as a burnt offering." This is something that God despises with a burning passion. You see, the truth is, God gave the land over to Israel because he was faithful to his promise. Not the promise that Jephthah made, but God's being faithful to the promise that he made centuries earlier. Promises that he made to Abraham and to every generation since then, that he would give this land to Israel. And Jephthah would have known that this land was his. He would have known that he didn't have to make that vow if he had been properly taught, and if he had taken the time to learn. If he had truly believed that God was faithful to his promises. You know, he said this all along. He said it straight to the king in his letter. He says, God is faithful. And there are many instances of God being faithful in his life. But when push came to shove, and the biggest, most important step up to the plate moment of his life happened, he took matters into his own hands. He trusted in his own faith, and it cost him the life of his daughter. This is the legacy of Jephthah. But how often do we do the same thing in our own lives? How often do we say, "Oh, we trust God. Oh, God's faithful. We believe that." Are we saying that? Do we truly believe it? Or are we just going along with what we've been taught to say? The good Christian, churchy thing to say, God is good, he's faithful. Do we see it in our lives? Today, I'm going to hand you each one of these index cards. And in my poorly written handwriting, it says, "Out of my hands and into the hands of the faithful one." God is still active and alive today. He's active and alive in the year 2021. So what I want you to do is sometime in the next week, write down an example of how God is faithful to you in this year. And put it someplace that you're going to see this every day as a reminder of who God truly is, the faithful one. I know for me, I already know what I'm going to I'm going to write, I see God's faithfulness in the fact that He called me here to KCU, and despite the fact that Dr. Coates has passed away, I know that the worship program is going to continue through his provision and through the work of the faculty and staff here. I see God's faithfulness in the fact that I have good Christian counsel and good Christian fellowship here to support me in my time of grief, as I support them in their time of grief. I'm going to take this card, I'm going to put it right next to my bed, right on my desk, so that the first thing I see every morning when I wake up is that reminder that God's faithful. I don't know what this is going to look like for you. You could see it in a promise that God has fulfilled. You might see it in a relationship that God has specifically put in your life. You might see it in the fact that you can wake up each morning knowing that you have a living hope inside of you, that Jesus Christ has taken your sin away. Whatever that is, find a spot in your life, your bed, your desk, your car, wherever. Place this there as a reminder that God is faithful. Because we have to start living in a way that reminds us that He is. If not, we're going to be hopeless. And I don't want to live in a world that's hopeless. Grace and peace.
Thank you.